EdTech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning and is part of the MasterCard Foundation Young Africa Works programming.
Hello and welcome to this edition of EdTech Mondays Africa, a series of conversations about harnessing the power of technology to transform education. This year, our focus on the series is the 10 recommendations from the 2024 MasterCard Foundation EdTech Conference to address identified ecosystem issues for mainstreaming and leveraging EdTech across the continent. Our previous edition looked at championing local innovation through EdTech policies, where we drew lessons from Rwanda on how intentional policy implementation equips young learners with relevant skills for the future. This edition delves deeper into recommendation 2, harmonizing cross-sector policy for EdTech adoption. And our poll question, we're asking, what should be the top priority in creating a cross-sector policy framework for education technology? Is it forming interministerial bodies, setting shared goals, pooling resources, or collaborating on data sharing? You can share your feedback with us here and on EdTech Mondays at mastercardfdn.org. And to contextualize our conversation, Africa is considered one of the continents with a learning crisis. According to the World Bank's EdTech Readiness Index, 53% of 10-year-old children from low and middle-income countries are unable to read and comprehend simple text. The World Bank also notes that with more countries eager to deploy technology to promote learning, standardized measures are needed to understand the role of EdTech within education systems, as well as enabling conditions for EdTech to support learning. To have this conversation, we have with us Stanley Kamanguya, Chief Executive Officer at the Kenya ICT Authority, Dr. Grace Githaiga, the Chief Executive Officer at Kenya ICT Action Network, who is joining us here in studio. We also have Dr. Ekua Bentil, Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank, and Ntebaleng Morake, a policy expert from South Africa. Thank you all for joining us. Let's begin with the question. What are the best ways to align policies across education, ICT, finance sectors for education technology adoption?
The area of education, just like ICTs, is broad. It has many stakeholders, and one stakeholder cannot determine what needs to happen. So definitely collaboration comes first on mind. How do we collaborate then to identify what are the strengths, what are the areas that, what are the gaps, what are the areas that need strengthening? And I think it is very important to look at education as a business, then look at technology and how technology then can enhance this business known as education. That leads to public-private partnerships. Very, very important, because how do we leverage on the resources? And resources in education are not just financial, but there's the issue of knowledge sharing, there's the issue of learning. So how do we then leverage on those public-private partnerships so that we pull together the various resources, the various financial issues that are required, and even the technical expertise from those who have expertise in education.
Stanley, let me come to you. What do you think we need to do to align policies across ICT, education, finance sectors for EdTech adoption? Because as we all know, we're being told that the future of work or the future of jobs is lying heavily towards technology. How do we make this happen?
I want to recall that when most of us were growing up, it was consistently reinforced in us that education is the foundation of life. And in the current world now, we are saying that the future is digital. So this is a very interesting nexus where we're discussing technology in the context of education, and I've used that sequencing very deliberately because the main issue here, is really education for purposes of well-being and socioeconomic development. But when we look at the issues around policy, I think from where I sit, we probably need to also take a step back and ask ourselves, what are the real issues that we're dealing with here, so that when we talk about policy harmonization, then, we can put it into context. One is a basic infrastructure that enables education. So roads, water, and all that. Second and most important is probably the issue around the digital infrastructure, its coverage and its access, because we have some issues around that. And then, of course, the issue of digital skilling, both for the students, but also for the education providers and everybody in the education value chain. And then we have some issues around the EdTech providers, as well as when you move towards how education projects are then, financed from a funding perspective. So first of all, for us to bring harmony in all these facets, I think each and every nation needs to establish a shared goal or a shared vision towards education and what the nation wants to achieve in that regard. We probably need, first of all, to have a shared vision, a shared goal, and make sure that this is communicated properly in terms of the roadmap that we want to take when we talk about driving EdTech. Once that is clear, then it becomes easy for every player to identify their role, both players and regulators. And actually, in each of those facets, it gets even more complicated because you have different type of actors. You have the players who do implementation, you have regulators, and then you have the private sector. So I think for me, establishing that and basically bringing all the stakeholders together should be able first to help us understand where we're going, but also what we need to do from a policy harmonization perspective.
Ekua, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well.
When it comes to collaboration, cross-sectoral collaboration, even within the World Bank, this is something that we struggle with, right? We have so many sectors across our organization that, getting us to talk to each other is always a challenge. So this is not something that is new or unique solely to, the government. This is something that we see running across society. So I'm glad we are talking about this today, although it's very important. It's not second nature. And most of my comments today will be based also on some of the lessons we've learned from a joint World Bank and MasterCard Foundation initiative, where we've been collaborating on supporting African governments through EdTech policy academies or courses. And so far, we've worked with over 300 participants across 20 countries in Africa. At one point, to also notice that education in the past has also tried to collaborate with various actors, whether it's health, right, or whether it's with the water sector, ensuring that the water and sanitation in schools are good, whether it's energy, ensuring that schools are connected, whether it's social protection, ensuring that, there's some kind of cash transfer that goes to parents to make sure they have money to send their kids to school. So education in its history, we know, has tried to at least collaborate in the sense of development, because education also touches all sectors, right? So I think in its nature, we ought to really collaborate because it touches these different aspects across the different sectors. So I think that's that first realization that it's a futile effort to try and go solo on that. And also, throughout this policy academy that we've been doing, one of the things that we've seen, and one example I would give, one country that we had, they wanted to support, EdTech policies for teachers. But within that country, the people in charge of running the training of the teachers they do not sit within the Ministry of Basic Education. And therefore, they sitting in their corner and working on such a policy, there will be no ownership, right, when it comes to implementation. And also, we realize that, as some of my panelists already indicated, the infrastructure aspect is huge. And therefore, Ministry of Education cannot go around connecting schools on their own, right? So that expertise does not sit with the ministry. So that's also important.
Ntebaleng, I want to hear from you, because now that you've heard from everybody else, what are your thoughts around aligning policies across sectors?
I mean, I agree with everything that the panelists have said so far. And I think most times, when we speak about the intersections of education and technology, we tend to forget the people that, this is essentially for, right? And I think the key thing to harmonizing, this the cross-sectoral aspect of the work is to really think about the young people who this education advances are for, right? Where is their voice, right? I think we tend to homogenize young people and think that, because they belong to a certain demographic of being youth, that their experiences are shared, right? And that they share the same experiences, which often isn't a thing. So I think for me, the first step is really just to understand the different needs that the different young people have, right? And by understanding that, we then can cater to those different needs. I think it goes back to that famous quote that says nothing about us without us, right? So the advances towards EdTech policy really have to be centering those voices of young people. I really think also, we have to think about the other ways that that deter or that become barriers for the implementation of EdTech in a lot of young people's lives, right? So, for example, we're told that education is the key, just to borrow from Stanley. But a lot of young people, it's almost like been given this key, but there is no car, right? So the infrastructure to get access to that does not exist, right? Kids are going to school hungry, right? The conditions in which they're learning in do not allow them to make the best use of the spaces in which they need to be learning in. And I think then when we speak about that that relationship from the different sectors is to first position education as a public good, and the social impact, the economic impact that education has on every different aspect of society, right? Be it in the economic space of the continent, be it in the education space, be it in the in the social development space. We, for us to advance, right, the education we have to recognize the full aspect of in the social impact of education.
With what's currently ongoing, on one hand, we have this huge divide where digital access is concerned. But at the same time, we need technology to drive education, especially the access part, because technology has proven to us that where learners are excluded, technology is able to bring them back into the learning circle. And so, Stanley, my question to you is, how can governments ensure that these policies stay flexible in a rapidly changing technology world?
It's very interesting because now we're not only dealing with rapid technology change, we are also seeing a shift in cultural change, a shift in how current generations and possibly future generations view this topic of even formal education. As we speak now, when you engage, for example, high schoolers, and you ask them whether they need to go to university, they have a different view, which is probably not what was the case several years ago. But coming to the matter of policy, I think that we have an opportunity to create adaptive policies through one or two approaches. Number one, and we have seen it work very well, at least in Kenya, when we're trying to do regulatory work, is use of sandboxes, to try different technologies end to end before we actually formalize them into policies or pieces of regulations. And then the second probably approach that can be explored is to create policies that allows a lot of co-creation between different stakeholders, because I think you'll find that the traditional policies were kind of fixed in terms of who should be the actors. I think we need to create policies that are a bit open, and then thirdly, the issue of inclusion, especially when it comes to EdTech, is becoming fundamental, so that then we can be able to carry everybody along. So it's to explore how maybe those three aspects, among others, can be considered when we are designing and developing policies for the future.
Ntebaleng, I saw you nodding. Do you want to add your thoughts to this before we move on to Ekua's thoughts as well in terms of government and private sector?
A lot of young girls, as much as they have, from like an institution perspective, right, we would say that, every person has access to education and every person has access to learning. But the reality is there's so many barriers that particularly young women face, right? So when we think of unpaid care work and, and I think it's very important to really hold that, as we think about effective ways of doing EdTech policies and of implementing, education technology across different platforms, because like I said, without considering all those things, then the policies won't actually be implemented effectively, because they will be leaving a lot of people behind. And in this case, young women and many other people that exist on the margins of society.
Ekua, the World Bank has collaborated with different African governments and those outside of the African continent, but maybe in the developing world as well. And one of the things that I have noticed from just a layman's perspective is just the frequency of transitioning of governments that we have, I think, every 5 to 7 years across the African continent. So one after the other and after the other. And with every one coming in, there's like a different direction that we are taking with our policies. But maybe you want to speak to us about the key challenges we face and how do we find solutions to them?
One of the issues that is really clear is the politicizing of education, right? And the need, if possible, to encourage governments to realize that there can be so many disruptions, right? When education becomes a short-term type of goal. It's important to realize that countries that have been successful in terms of the education policies, and this is not even unique to EdTech policies, but across the board, when the thinking around education is short-term focused and it's around elections and governments coming in and going out and changing, and these policies changing along with the government and not building on what prior administrations have done, is always disruptive. And it's important to be able to maintain some of these policies that are working well, building of policies that are yet to be completed, and the implementation of those policies across 15, 20 years, and gradually and continuously making them better, right? All of those things are key. And related to this particular point, and one of the other challenges that we've seen when we've worked with countries on EdTech policies is also this sense of so many policies existing across the board that are not necessarily interconnected, right? And I remember, some of the discussions we had with the technical teams from the different ministries realize that someone is sitting in ministry A and is not aware of a policy in ministry B that impacts them. And so it was interesting that it was even in some of these discussions as part of the policy academy that some participants would say, oh, I didn't know, we had this policy or strategy that existed, in our country. And so it's important that there's harmonization even with the policies, right? So there are not too many of them that exist. By ensuring that the ones that exist are comprehensive and touch on the different groups that they need to touch on, as Ntebaleng was indicating, the who that the policies impact are very, very important points. And so we need to make sure that all the dots, right, across the different agencies are connected well.
We're not short of policies. I think we're just short of the implementation part. And I think the fact that you mentioned that sometimes we move on to a different policy when the previous one was not even touched on in terms of implementation. And Grace, with all of that has been shared, Stanley talked about co-creation, and we also saw Ntebaleng talking about collaboration, and Ekua has talked about harmonizing these policies, inter-ministerial or inter-ministry policies as well. But, from your side of things, you've observed that maybe the world is changing, and so are the needs for education. The needs of education back then are probably not what we need right now. But then there's a gap there that as we advance in technology, we are leaving a generation that is still in the phase of they do not have access to textbooks, for example. And so we are skipping them and we're moving on with the technology. How do we make sure that we close these loops and bring them into the circle, include them in the education ecosystem?
Tech is developing, and we are critically saying that it's very important in education. For example, if we check the example of Kenya, the CBC requires that learners use gadgets to conduct research. So you have that element that is tech, and then you have another one that is education. Did these two talk together? So there's need to have a unified framework of implementation that then brings tech and education together in harmony, so that then we are looking at the different needs of these stakeholders. I think there was need. Somebody pointed out the issue of participation, and again, I'll give the example. I like Kenya because public participation is enshrined in our constitution. Whenever you're making public policy, and so if stakeholders are not consulted, or some people sit somewhere and come up with that policy, then it's not going to really fill the gap that is there. And on to your question. So we are talking of, education that embraces tech, but are we looking at the marginalized areas? Are we looking at remote areas? And, for example, we are working with, we are implementing a digital program in two rural areas, in Mandara and in Busia. And you will be amazed. People do not have gadgets because we live in the city. We assume, when you're privileged, you really never think of those who are not privileged. So for you, even buying bundles, data bundles, is, it comes, naturally. But you tell people to buy the bundles, it's not affordable. And I think Stanley talked about affordability and accessibility. Those need to be considered. And how do we do that? We have to consider the need to have subsidies, to have or tax incentives on these devices, especially those that are used for education. Because how do we get that content to these marginalized people? The other thing, and again, it has come out of our work, is that we must make digital literacy part of national curriculums. And how do we do that? That must be embraced in a policy that allows people to discuss in an adaptive. I think Stanley raised that. So we must be people who adapt to situations, to context, to the needs of the users, so that we don't have one that takes 2 years. We have an adaptive policy that allows stakeholders to contribute and to ensure that no one is left behind.
Adaptability is important. Ekua, I want to come to you now because I'm sure you have observed how African countries are doing. Is there an example of a country that has done it right, where harmonization of cross-sector policy is concerned? Because maybe we could use this as a case study to then look into how other African countries can adapt the same. Are you able to tell us one of the countries? I know that Rwanda has been talked about quite a bit, but would like to hear your thoughts around any other African country that has been able to do this in a very streamlined way.
Among the countries that we've been working with, Rwanda was one of the countries that went through the police academy that I mentioned earlier. And from that, they worked closely with the World Bank and other stakeholders to really develop their EdTech strategy. But also, we've seen some good examples from Kenya. We have our teams working with the colleagues there as well. You've seen Ethiopia as well, and even Tanzania. And I also recently learned that the World Bank had been working with Zimbabwe, I think 2016, thereabout, to develop their policies around ICT in education. So we have seen several African countries taking this good step forward of trying to harmonize their EdTech policies and ensuring that these are done as a collective. And, in the case of these countries that I've mentioned, they created a task force that was basically across different sectors, multi-sectoral. And then also they did on-the-ground assessments, right, to ensure that they were not flying blind, to say where are the needs. And, with the conversations that we're having here, our ultimate goal is to ensure that there's education for all and quality education for all, right? So in order to understand where the gaps are, which rural community needs, what particular needs exist there with respect to implementation of their tech policies, the assessment is key. So basically, there's the creation of the task force across ministries. In addition to that, assessments to determine where the gaps are, and then having really strong timelines, because I know there's some countries that have a lot of approvals, and sometimes it takes months. By the time these policies get approved, then technology has moved on and things have happened. And so it's important that the timeliness of these policies are ensured. I know there are countries where the energy ministry was strongly involved, which is also critical, right, in terms of ensuring that there's enough power that is reliable in the schools to ensure that these gadgets or devices are functional.
Right. With the goal to, mainstream sort of hybrid learning across the African continent, and indeed technology in education, I think we are also seeing that there's an increased development of solutions by entrepreneurs towards education. There are different solutions. Some are AI enabled and that are giving access to education to some of the learners who are continuously left out of the education ecosystem. But Ntebaleng, I want to hear your thoughts on this. How can we ensure that EdTech companies or EdTech entrepreneurs are aligning their products with the national education goals? Because one thing we've also observed throughout the process is that sometimes solutions are created before understanding the needs of certain education curricula. For example, there are solutions like gaming solutions that might not really align with the curricula of a particular country, maybe South Africa or Kenya or Rwanda. So how do we make sure that they understand the policies of particular countries and align the development of their solutions to these policies?
That is something that, we see a lot, and I think it's a reality. I know in the context that I'm in, it's definitely something that we see a lot. And I think one of the first things to stop that is just to ensure that the conversations, so I mean, there's a thing around engagements with politicians, right? As these people that we see once in every 5 years, and that's when we see active democracy, right? So like positioning democracy as like a once in 5 years occasion, which isn't the case, right? It's constant. It's just constant engagement. So I really think that people who are working on developing products, EdTech products, really need to be participating in multiple layers of government, right? Because governments need to be working for people, right? So getting involved in different portfolio committees, for example, right? Shaping the legislation processes, but also, I think, I mean, it's said that in like the policy space, but I don't know if like how real it is. But we also need to be leveraging and actually calling on governments as well to say, hey, this is where technology is advancing to. This is the data that we have, right? And sharing those insights, right? Because I think the public participation process shouldn't be one-sided. It shouldn't only be that every time there's a set policy or white paper and we need people to sort of comment from it. We also need to be positioning or putting politicians and people in power in positions where we're saying these are the advancements in work that we're doing, right? And I think also one thing about I think the pushback from the politicians with people designing products and stuff is also maybe coming from a thing that there isn't a relationship that is built. I think building those relationships are really important, but also continuing the tradition of what that education system actually looks like, right? So how do we harness the things that we have and the things that we own to bridge that gap? But also, I think another thing for me that I've really been thinking about is, the fact that people also have people have a fear of technology, right? And it's something that we can't sit and act like isn't happening, right? So people who are occupying positions of power, because they don't know, it's like, oh, I'm not going to get involved, right? So it should be the responsibilities of those who know, i.e. people designing the products, to say, hey, this is what we can do, right? This is how gamification can help, solve the fact that young people by the age of by grade 3 can read for meaning, right? These are the interventions, and really positioning it from a space of talking to each other as opposed to talking, to. I think because that does really can lead to a form of disrupting the relationship building processes.
When we started this conversation, Stanley did open up by saying we need to also include the funding model. How do we fund our digital infrastructure? And as we bring this conversation to a close, I also wanted us to touch on the funding models or financing strategies that could make this happen, because we've talked about the fact that we're not short of policies, we're short of implementation. And maybe there's a gap in there that we come up with policies that require funding of the implementation, but then we get stuck somewhere along the way. What kind of financing strategies could work best for us, are most effective in ensuring that our EdTech initiatives are sustainable and accessible? That by the time we get to 2050, when 1 in 4 people born in the world will be African, that these policies we're putting in place will still be able to live up to that time of sustainability.
I can only say one, that the government holds the exchequer, the bag, the finances, and therefore the interventions that need to happen in EdTech need to be systemic, so that if the government takes a funding model that works, it is able to implement at scale. As people who support that, we can only do so much. It would take us 20 years, say, to reach the entire Kenya. But the government has that. So the intervention, the funding model must be systemic so that the government is able to scale. Secondly, there's need to consider local innovations. There are many local innovations that are happening. How do we then make them contribute? And funding is not just finance, it could also be in terms of the workforce, the ideas. How then do we make that part of the funding model so that you're saying EdTech, yes, the government has contributed the money, but the innovators are going to be supporting the tech system. And finally, I think when we experiment with all that, we need to have a platform, again, by governments, because again, the government holds the big bag. That allows for documenting of best practices, for documenting of gaps, for documenting of struggles, so that if Kenya has succeeded in that, then Tanzania can go in there on that platform and decide we are not going to go the Kenyan way, we are going to do it differently and avoid this hiccup.
From a funding perspective, we have a big problem when it comes to coordination of development partners and several social organizations. And from where I sit, it is because, I think it is largely because some of the solutions that are being proposed are more supply driven. So you'll find an EdTech innovator or developer or provider has gotten into a partnership with a certain donor or a certain social organization, and they have approached one government agency, or for our case in Kenya, we have different levels of government. They have approached a county government for purposes of early learning and so on. And you find you have so many pockets of, EdTech initiatives going around, which causes a lot of confusion and disharmony. So what we have done as a country is to adopt a donor coordination committee under the Deputy President's office, which is helping probably to try and box everybody into one place. Because then we are able to maximize the resources that are available from these donors for this purpose. And then secondly, and we have to be very careful so that we do not stifle innovation by trying to standardize, but at least we have some structure in terms of how those programs are rolled out. So I think we need to continuously call upon our social organization development partners to help us. And I'm sure probably this problem is also in other countries, to avoid this replication of initiatives by different partners.
This is a very interesting conversation, particularly because we can't separate what we're seeing and what we're experiencing from the geopolitical or just the political economy of education, of financing that we see across the world. I think what we're experiencing is an extension of what is happening across the world. I think we're increasingly seeing governments thinking that austerity is the way, right? Which also results in different, sectors and departments not wanting to collaborate because, the lack of financing puts a lot of departments of sectors in competition with each other. We shouldn't, right? We shouldn't be having a conversation around whether we need to be funding health, or we need to be funding education, or we need to be funding access to digital skills or skills for the future. Like, that should not be the conversation. But the reality is we do find ourselves in this position, not just on the continent, and it's happening everywhere. So I think that's definitely something to hold. And I think as we think of solutions, we really need to be holding, those aspects that come with the political economy of society as we see it right now. I think, one thing I also just really want to say, and it's really just brought from my own personal experiences, growing up in, a township in Tembisa in the east of Johannesburg, where I saw firsthand the power of, people, coming together to sort of build a society that worked for them, even though they were ostracized or put in the margins of society. So I think as we think of ways of financing, education and EdTech, we really shouldn't forget, the communities that are working, right? Even though they've got very limited resources, but just what kind of innovative community building exercises are happening in different communities for people to fund education and to fund advancements in innovation in education for their particular context. So we've got a lot of women's groups in rural communities, in semi-urban communities, and these are like working class or poor women, right, who are putting whatever money they have to be able to advance. And I think as we think of ways of financing EdTech, we really shouldn't forget that, right? We should really think about how to tap into those, ecosystems so that we can achieve, and we don't make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. So I think that's very important for me.
And leaving no one behind. I think everybody has talked about leaving no one behind, including Grace. But Ekua, now that you're coming in with a to-do list for us, what do we need? What check boxes do we need to tick to harmonize this cross-sector policy where funding is concerned in finality as we bring this to a close?
Unfortunately, when it comes to technology as a whole, in general, on the continent, we have a few problems. Digital infrastructure is expensive, first of all, and it depreciates. Technology changes rapidly, right? And the procurement aspect of it is also not trivial. And then we also know the aspects of the digital skills that is lacking in some communities on the continent, which makes, so all of these as a collective makes it very difficult. But when we talk about sustainability and accessibility of EdTech to within education, why is this really critical, and what are some ways in terms of funding that we can use to support this? So one way that we've seen really in terms of the funding models is what we call resource-based funding, right? Where you ensure that there is some accountability to the funding that governments have received or schools have received, right? To ensure that learning is happening in the different schools, no matter where those schools are, and that also the youth are able to transition out of schooling into jobs, right? So looking at case studies in terms of how are the youth being skilled in that sense. So attaching results to funding that's provided is always key to ensure that when you go to the schools, the equipment are not sitting in boxes, devices are not sitting in boxes because the head teacher is scared that the students will spoil the device, right? But to ensure that it's in the hands of the end user that was intended to be in the hands of.
And I guess with that, we've sort of contextualized what it takes to harmonize cross-sector policy. Thank you all so much. I appreciate the time you've taken to enlighten us on what it takes to make policies work across sectors. I appreciate that. And until the next conversation, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to continuing these conversations. Remember, Harmonizing cross-sector policy for EdTech adoption was recommendation 2 from the MasterCard Foundation EdTech conference. We are making sure that by the time we have a similar gathering of stakeholders in the EdTech sector, we will have covered all the 10 recommendations. Thank you all for joining us in this edition of EdTech Mondays Africa. My name is Doreen Bira. Until the next one, bye-bye for now.
EdTech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning and is part of the MasterCard Foundation Young Africa Works programming.